welcome everyone. Thank you for attending. This is the NMSU, New Mexico State University, and Xerces Society webinar series called Supporting Pollinators and Beneficial Insects in Backyards and on Farms. And this episode, we're going to be talking about attracting and supporting pollinators on New Mexico farms. And for just a little housekeeping information, we have a Q&A at the bottom of the screen. We don't have the chat enabled, but you can ask questions through the Q&A. Just go ahead and type those in. Please ask questions early as soon as they come up, because that way we can get to more questions at the end of Emily's presentation. So please type those in as soon as you come up with them. And if we don't get to them, we will be able to answer them in our final webinar of the series, which is a Ask Me Anything expert roundtable. So we'll be answering lots of questions that didn't get answered or that you might have emailed us up until that webinar. Another thing is that we do have closed captioning available. I believe if you go to the bottom of your screen and click on More, and you can click, you can show subtitles if you would like to see those, or you can click Don't Show Me Subtitles if those are distracting. And so I'll go ahead and introduce Emily. She is a Pollinator Conservation Specialist with the Xerces Society, and she is in the Pesticide program. And she received a Master of Science in Entomology from Michigan State University, and she has studied habitat restoration, bee nesting habits, and the effects of pest management practices on wild bee communities. And her work with Xerces since 2015 has focused on supporting pollinators and beneficial insects through habitat creation and mitigating pesticide risk to bees and other beneficial insects. And with that, I'll let Emily take on the webinar.
Great, thanks so much, Caitlin. I did also want to mention that we have Miranda Kirsten here, who's a senior program specialist with NMSU at the Las Lunas station. She will be with us to answer questions at the end of this webinar as they come in. So again, please ask questions early and often, and Caitlin and Miranda will help answer them in the Q&A. So this is our fourth webinar in our series on New Mexico pollinators and beneficial insects. And this one is really focused on sort of farms, crop pollination, and a little bit about ranching as well. Next week, we're gonna be talking about how we can protect pollinators while managing pests. So I'm gonna be joined by Dr. Amanda Skidmore from the NMSU Las Lunas station to talk about pesticides, pollinators, and integrated pest management. What are the risks of pesticides? How can we manage pests while protecting pollinators? Today, I'm going to talk more about farm management practices that are not pesticides. I'll mention them a little bit, but we're going to go into that more detail next week. But today, we're going to talk more about sort of habitat opportunities on the farm. But starting with a little bit of review on bee life history info and how bees contribute to pollination of different crops. All right. So just to start off, I want to give thanks to New Mexico State University for hosting this program, and to the Carol Petrie Foundation for supporting Xerces' work in the Southwest, as well as to our many members who make our work possible. Xerces is a conservation organization based in the Pacific Northwest, but we have folks all across the states working on conservation of invertebrates. We have our biggest program is in agricultural biodiversity and pollinators, but we also work on endangered species and aquatic invertebrates and urban conservation efforts. So this will be a review to everyone who's joined us through the rest of this series. And I do want to mention, we are going to send out the links to those videos to everyone who's registered throughout the series. So if you need to go back and review what was said in an earlier video, you know, our first one was on bees, and then our next was on beneficial insects. Those are going to be available to you, and I'd encourage you to go check them out if you haven't seen them. So I'll only give a quick review of the basic info. But to review, there are many different kinds of animals, insects and vertebrate animals that contribute to the pollination of wild and managed plant species. So there's butterflies and flies and beetles and bees that move pollen between flowers and help plants set seeds and fruit. Among these, bees are the sort of the VIPs, the very important pollinators. They are the most important because they are actively going out and collecting and transporting pollen around. So they are quite efficient. They have all these specialized body structures that help them carry that pollen around. And many of them are carrying it dry on their bodies. So when they move it onto another flower, it easily moves off and helps fertilize that plant as well. So they're quite efficient at handling flowers and moving pollen from flower to flower. They're also quite diverse. So we have our one honeybee. Honeybee is one species here. And then this is the diversity of all the other different kinds of bees that we have in the United States. We have about 3,600 species of native bees here in the United States. Over 1,000 of those are found in New Mexico. So we have over a quarter of the entire country's diversity of bees here in the state. Some of the big species groups include mining bees. So Andrenidae, that's that big pink chunk over on the top left. We have digger bees, which are quite common in New Mexico. Many are sunflower specialists. Sweat bees, mason and leafcutter bees, other big species groups. Interestingly, one of the highest diversity bee groups, the big orange chunk up on the top right, is cuckoo bees. Cuckoo bees, the technical term is kleptoparasites. They have these specialized host-parasite relationships with other bees. So they lay their eggs in the nest of other bee species where they can then take advantage of the pollen and nectar resources that were collected by those bees. These relationships can be really specific. It can just be one cuckoo bee species to one host bee species. So if the host bee is declining, the cuckoo bee that depends on that host is almost certainly going to be declining. So some of these are among the more vulnerable bee species and very among the least well understood of all bee species as well. But that's another talk for another day. The diversity of these pollinating insects and the plants that they pollinate, that diversity exploded together in the sort of late Cretaceous period. So there's still some arguments among researchers about the chicken and the egg of which came first, the diversity of pollinators and the diversity of plants that they pollinate. But whatever the case, they did explode together generally over the same time period with lots of further development of really specialized relationships between plants and their pollinators. Some plants need certain bees for pollination. So this is not a species we have in New Mexico, but it's one that's up in the Northeast. It's the closed gentian. So that is a plant that can only be pried open with the strong forearms of a bumblebee. So that has a very specialized plant-pollinator relationship. So that plant is dependent on that pollinator for setting its seeds. Then there are flowers that are visited by all kinds of different things that are more open access flowers that are often very generalist in what kinds of bees come to them. On the other side of the equation, some bees need certain plants. So there are many different bees that are specialists on plants in the aster family. That includes sunflowers. So lots of different bees that specialize on sunflowers. There are other bees that specialize on legumes or mallows or creosote. So the interesting thing here is they can be a bit of a one-way relationship, right? So you have sunflowers that have lots of bees that specialize on that plant, but that plant is actually getting visited by many different kinds of bees, in part because it has just such rich pollen resources. So I can't highlight every specialist, but I just wanted to give you a small window into some of the specialized relationships there. And let's quickly review 2 nesting habits. So the reason that I wanted to review all of this is first for anyone who wasn't with us for earlier webinars, but also because in order to attract and support and conserve these pollinators, we need to be keeping in mind what they really need to thrive, what they need to be resilient. So we need to be able to know what to give them. So let's talk about where they live and how we can support them by supporting those nesting habits. So we have about 30% of our native bees live above ground, either in cavities or in tunnels and stems. So our bumblebees are cavity nesters. They like to live in old rodent holes and other, sometimes in stumps, wherever there's sort of cavities available where they can build their messy social nests. Then we have solitary tunnel nesting bees, like the mason bee pictured here. And then the majority of bees, the rest of bees, live below ground. So many of those species are solitary. It's just a single female going out and doing the work of provisioning that nest. But they live in anywhere from the very surface of the soil down to a meter below ground. Above ground, those nests can be very difficult to spot. I spent my master's trying to go find bee nests, and let me tell you, it is hard to find them sometimes. Much easier in New Mexico, I think, than it was up in Michigan, trying to hunt through thatch, looking for what looked to be ant nests on the top of the soil surface. But they can be found in sort of patchy turf, but more often you'll see them on bare exposed ground where they're able to sort of easily dig themselves into the ground. They like those sandy to loamy soils that are a little bit easier for them to get into, but some of them will also nest in quite compacted soils and in clay. Underneath the soil surface, those nests can be very complicated, going off and branching off in all kinds of directions. Above ground, these are ones that you really don't see too much of in southern New Mexico, but maybe in riparian habitats and areas with more trees near the bosque, you'll see more tunnel nesting bees that live in wood or that live in pithy stems of plants. So this down at the bottom right here, we have a small carpenter bee. I have those living in my Monarda stems, my bee balm stems out in my front yard. So they basically like to choose holes that are roughly the size of their body. So there's lots of different plants with different sort of sizes of their stems. And the larger the size of that hole, the larger the bee that will tend to nest in it. And once you get much larger, you end up with more like grass-carrying wasps nesting in those types of holes. So in terms of thinking about how you can conserve that, we're looking at conserving places that have snags and brush piles, and then providing bees with some pithy stemmed plants like bee balm and many others. Some of these bees are provisioning those nests or building sort of nest cells with different kinds of plant materials or mud. So your leafcutter bees will take these nice little chunks out of different plant leaves and bring them back to the nest and use them to build walls between their nest cells. Mason bees will do the same thing with mud. And there are other bees that build that with resin or with plant fiber or even with flower petals. But I am here to talk to you mainly today about some of the contributions these bees make to crops. So that could be in your garden or can be on a much larger scale. On a global scale, pollination contributes to about 35% of global crop production by volume. So some crops are entirely dependent on pollinators. So without a pollinator, you don't get seeds or fruit. Many other crops fall on a bit of a spectrum from the plant produces some kind of fruit, but then pollination allows it to produce bigger and marketable fruits. So blueberry would be an example of that. This is a picture of, on the right-hand side, you have a cluster that was bagged with a mesh during bloom. So pollinators weren't able to access the blueberry flowers. So the plant was able to produce some small berries, but they were they're about half the size of the pollinated berries. So on the left-hand side, you have the cluster that was left open for bees to visit. And you see you get much riper, much larger berries when you have pollination. So that's sort of the contribution of pollinators to many different kinds of crops around the world. Those crops supply most of the color on our plates and also most of the vitamins and minerals that we get in our diets. Looking broadly at commercial scale agriculture across the country, who is doing the pollinating. So the managed honeybee is our #1 agricultural pollinator. Its hives contain many thousands of workers, and they are mobile. So they can be moved around to different crops that bloom at different times of the year. They can be placed right in the middle of big blocks of orchard or other crops where small bees that live in sort of natural habitats around the farm might not be able to get all the way into the middle of one of those big monocrop blocks. So pollination is a big business. There are millions of hives that are moved cross-country annually. About 3/4 of the 2.5 million hives that we have in the US are commercially managed. The rest are backyard beekeepers. A lot of movement is driven by California almonds. So California almonds are one of the crops that are entirely dependent on pollination for nutset. So there are about 500,000 permanent commercial hives in California, but almonds need about 2 million hives for a very short window in February to get all of that pollination done on these massive orchard blocks. Demand is high and rental prices are also high. So commercial beekeepers bring hives cross-country to park them in almonds for a few weeks around Valentine's Day. They move them, from Florida and Texas in melons and cucumbers and citrus up to California. And then there are different routes for different commercial beekeepers, but some go up to the Pacific Northwest. Others go and spend the summers out in the Dakotas and the Great Plains. Others bring their bees up to Michigan and the Northeast. So lots of movement of commercial bees. So these managed bees enable planting of big blocks of crops that wouldn't be able to be fully pollinated without managed honeybees. But is this system sustainable? I imagine that looking through the lens of the current pandemic, you might be able to see how bringing 85% of the population to a single place for a couple weeks isn't a great scenario for disease and pathogen transfer. So this is a bit of a fragile system in a way, one that beekeepers have to work really hard to sustain. So what I want to talk to you about today is about how we can build habitat and management strategies into our local farms to support pollinators that are living and visiting flowers in the local area to provide that sort of longer term permanent pollinator and pollination resilience. I talked quite a bit at the beginning there about the diversity of bees. And it turns out that diversifying bees can have great benefits for crop pollination and yields. There was a big review study that was done a few years ago looking at 41 different pollinated crops around the globe. And they actually found that even in places that had honeybees, wild pollinators provided better quality pollination when they were present. So they were setting fruit at actually twice the rate of honeybees. So basically, they were arguing honeybees aren't a substitute for a diverse whole pollinator community. They can contribute in different ways to the pollination of crops. And in many cases, wild bees that have more specialized relationships with these plants can be more efficient pollinators of those plants. So this is from a study in apples in Wisconsin that basically found that as the number of species that they saw in orchards went up, they got higher fruit set. So the more diverse the pollinator community visiting those apple orchards, the better the fruit set and yield in the orchard. Having a diverse apple pollinator community is key to getting good pollination. And you'll see that there are other studies I could have shown here that are for other crops, but this one is from Wisconsin. Another interesting piece here, which echoes that review I just showed you, is that they were working half in orchards that had managed honeybees and half in orchards that were just pollinated by wild pollinators. And they didn't see a difference in fruit set between those orchards. So they basically concluded that having a diverse wild pollinator community was what was essential in getting a good crop. So why is that? Why do having wild bees around, why did they improve pollination of crops? So if we go back to almonds, there's been a ton of research on pollination in almonds. This is from a study that was done back in 2012 in almond orchards. And almonds, like some other some other crop species, they're varietally self-incompatible. What that means is they need pollen from a different variety in order to produce nuts and set fruit. So pollen basically has to come from that different variety, and many orchards are set up with single variety rows. So you have the same variety going down a row, and then the next row will be a different variety. So you want to achieve good nut set, you want bees moving between your rows. But individual honeybees have a tendency to forage straight down a row. You'll see this on a hedgerow or a tree line too. Honeybees just tend to kind of keep going down the same row. So in an orchard setting, that means that they would be transferring a lot of incompatible pollen. But here's the kicker. In orchards that had a lot of wild bees present, wild bees actually came in and interacted with honeybees in ways that caused those honeybees to move more between rows. So you would see this in an interaction between bees on an individual flower, right? You have one bee on the flower, another bee comes in and kind of messes with the first one, and the first bee flies off in a huff. And that's kind of what they were seeing on an orchard scale with honeybees. Wild bees caused the honeybees to move more in a way that increased row-to-row movement and improved pollination and nut set in the orchard. So that's one mechanism by which having some diversity can help with pollination of crops. Another ways that we know that some native bees are stronger flyers and better equipped for flying in cooler and rainier and windier weather than honeybees and some smaller native bees. So big-bodied bees like bumblebees and mason bees can be particularly good in those cooler and windier conditions, especially in crops where that's happening all the way through bloom. It's good to have some of those large-bodied bees around. Different species of bees can also provide complementary pollination. So again, from looking at almond orchards, they found in windy conditions, honeybees tend to move into the center of trees where they're a little bit more protected from the wind. And they found that some of the stronger flying native bees actually stayed at the outsides of trees during those windy conditions. So in orchards where they had wild bees and honeybees present, the whole tree got pollinated even in windy conditions, whereas in orchards that just had honeybees, mostly the inside of the tree was what was getting visits from bees. So this is what we would call sort of complementary pollination, right? Each type of bee contributing in complementary ways to the whole. So let's take a look at another crop, and this is one that's a little bit more of a specialized relationship between some native bees and the crop itself. So this is a blueberry flower chopped in half here, and what you're looking at inside are the anthers. So inside the anthers is where you have pollen. So the pollen is kept inside the anthers. These are called poricidal anthers, where there's a sort of a pore at the end of the anther, and the pollen basically needs to get shaken out like a salt shaker. So how does that happen? So I hope you can see this video, but this is what's called buzz pollination. This bee is vibrating its wing muscles. I'm gonna show it to you again here. It's vibrating its wing muscles to be able to pull that pollen out of the poricidal anther here. So there's a variety of different flowers. There's a lot of different flowers that have anthers that are like this. Tomato, it would be another example. So blueberries and tomatoes both benefit quite a bit from this behavior of buzz pollination, of being able to shake this pollen out with wing muscle vibration. And it's a behavior that honeybees, for whatever reason, just don't have. So bumblebees, sweat bees, and a few other kinds of native bees can buzz pollinate. So looking at tomatoes, this is a study from California looking at sun gold tomatoes, having native bees present, like these bumblebees, nearly tripled the production of their cherry tomatoes, which makes a lot of sense when you think about how much a plant would benefit from having all of that pollen shaken out of its anthers and ready for cross-pollination. So another example of a specialized crop relationship, and I think I have maybe one or two more, and then we'll move into how we can support crop pollinators. But this is squash bees. So if you grow squash in New Mexico, you probably have squash bees around. These are bees that are an obligate pollinator, meaning they just collect pollen from this plant. So everything from in the cucurbits is what this squash bee collects and feeds to its young for their development. They tend to nest in the ground underneath squash plants, and they're active in the real early morning, so before sunrise. Males are up and active just before dawn, females sort of right around dawn. And squash is a plant that only takes a few visits to actually fully pollinate. So it only takes about 3 to 7 bees to come in and visit that squash, 3 to 7 visits to fully pollinate it. So flowers are actually typically fully pollinated by these squash bees before honeybees are even up and out of their hive in the morning. Across the US, looking at sites in many different states, most had their pollination needs met by squash bees alone. So they're massive contributors to pollination of cucurbits across the entire United States. My colleague Jennifer actually did a project looking at urban farms and community gardens in St. Louis. So these bees can find very, very small patches of squash. They're amazing at finding small patches of squash. And they were present at each of these urban lots and community gardens. And they were the most abundant pollinator at all sites, even at sites with honeybees and other native bees present. So to go a little bit deeper on one plant that's important in New Mexico, that's Chile, which has obviously a storied history in New Mexico with distinct cultivars that have emerged in different valleys across the state through selective breeding over many hundreds of years. So I don't know if you've talked much about Chile pollination, but they're largely self-pollinated, where the plant can produce fruit with the absence of a pollinator. This is why the hatch chili is being studied for use in space, but they do benefit from pollination. The pollination increases fruit size and seed set in chilies. One greenhouse study actually found that intercropping with basil significantly improved pollination and fruit set of chilies, increasing yield. But one thing to be aware of with pollination in chilies is that cross-pollination means hybridization with other capsicum varieties that are within the flight range of bees that are visiting those plants, right? So if you're looking to preserve an heirloom variety or to save seeds, be aware of what else is growing in the vicinity. So just one thing to be aware of, but in general, pollination does improve the fruit size of chilies and many other fruits and vegetables that you might grow. So how do we take that information and translate it into creating a resilient and abundant local crop pollinating population? The answer is habitat. We need to give them the things that they need, right? So this was looking at watermelons in Central Valley of California, and they were just looking for, what are the factors that lead you to have a good pollination community? They found that native bees were able to fully pollinate Central Valley watermelons when more than a third of the area around the farm was natural habitat. So that's a landscape scale approach, but actually there's lots of evidence that putting habitat even in small patches on farms can help benefit crop pollinators and the pollination yield of crops grown on gardens or in farms. If you build it, will they come? The answer is nearly always yes. How do we build habitat into farm and ranch landscapes to support pollinators? So this is the same basic framework that we've been talking about throughout this series, but the three main components of good habitat are food, so nectar and pollen, flowering plants, shelter, so nesting sites and overwintering sites, and then protection from pesticides. So overwintering and nesting habitats take a variety of different forms. Some of these are sort of more taken from temperate landscapes, but the main thing you need is just undisturbed areas that have a little bit of messiness. Brush piles, snag trees, bunch grasses, plants that have pithy stems. all of these habitat features can provide shelter and egg laying and nesting sites for bees and other beneficial insects. So you want to know where to start on a farm. The process for sort of supporting farm pollinators starts with an assessment. And we have some kind of complicated habitat assessment guides that we offer on our website. One for farms and ag landscapes, one that's more for natural areas and rangelands. And the point of this guide is to sort of walk through the process of what are you looking for and how do you identify areas for improvement. So the first step is looking to recognize and conserve existing habitat. So what do you already have that's contributing to pollinators on your property? And then identify areas that are deficient, right? So gaps in bloom. Do you have a time during the year when nothing is blooming, where if a bee shows up and it's looking for nectar and pollen, it's not going to find anything? So that would be a habitat deficiency. You might also look for a lack of diversity in what's flowering. Maybe you have something flowering, but it's the only thing that flowers. And you want to support many different kinds of pollinators. So maybe you can improve how many things are flowering at any given time. And then you might not have areas for undisturbed nesting. So those are things to look for. And this is, the habitat assessment guides that we offer can help with that process if you're not sure what to look for. And then from there, you can sort of prioritize habitat improvements. What do I need to change in order to build more resilience and support into the landscape? So that might mean plugging in some kind of bloom gap through the season, or it might mean changing tillage practices or some other kind of farm practice. There are lots of opportunities for plugging those gaps, for building that habitat in, that can take a spectrum of approaches. So you can find sort of odd spaces that can be good places for permanent habitat. So permanent cover that has flowering forbs, bunch grasses, sort of all the pieces of good habitat for bees and other beneficial insects. And I did want to mention, Miranda's here as a presenter, and she presented about beneficial insects before, but NMSU has been trialing different plant species at the Las Lunas station for how much they attract pollinators. This is some of their test plots there. But the main idea is looking for native, locally adapted species that support pollinators, that have maybe a variety of different flower structure types, different plant families, building that diversity in throughout the season, always having something in bloom. That's the basic framework, whether you're on a farm, whether you're in an urban center, the basic idea is the same. And then the more that you can plant, the better. One thing I will say is that the best way to find out what's working is just to watch for activity and plant more of what's kind of abuzz with bees. This was a slide that Caitlin had in last week's presentation about habitat in urban spaces. And this is drawn from the NRCS Plant Materials Center guide that came out a few years ago about pollinator plants for New Mexico. So we will link that out to you, and it will be linked in the video at the end. But this has sort of this continuous bloom season idea of showing you when different species that attract pollinators bloom throughout the year. And you sort of want to build that continuous bloom into whatever space you're managing. But I do want to say, creating habitat doesn't have to be hard. It doesn't have to be super expensive. The highest quality habitat is going to be that sort of permanent, diverse, continuous blooming habitat. But partial habitats that bloom for a part of the season or that contribute one species, those are important too, and bees will absolutely find them and use them. So with that in mind, another habitat opportunity is flowering cover crops. So if you have, cover cropping is used in a variety of different management systems for a variety of different reasons. But if you allow those to flower before they terminate, those can be good resources for bees. So in the warm season, species like buckwheat or alfalfa actually can be great pollinator resources over the cold season. Your brassicas, this is canola here in the picture, clovers, hairy vetch, all of those can also contribute to pollinators. And they have multiple benefits. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why cover cropping is used. It's to control erosion, to manage nutrients, to suppress weeds. But you can have all of those things and support pollinators at the same time. Another opportunity that's similar would be intercropping. So this is, again, a temperate environment, but there's lots of different ways to incorporate annual flowers between row crops. And kitchen herbs like basil and mints and dill are attractive and relatively low cost options that are really attractive to a variety of pollinators. Having these intercropped can also benefit crop pollination. I think I mentioned before, having basil intercropped with chilies actually benefited fruit size in those chilies. These can also be rotations between annual crops. It doesn't have to be just a strip next to your row crop. Lots of different opportunities here. Before I move on to talking about woody plants and rangelands, I did want to mention an idea worth exploring, which is that pollinator habitat might be considered a beneficial use of acequia irrigation, and that cultivating pollinator habitat could be a low impact, low maintenance option for maintaining water rights alongside pollinators. So this is an idea in development by Adrienne Rosenberg in her work at the NMSU Sustainable Ag Science Center in Alcalde, as well as the New Mexico Acequia Association. This field plot is one that Adrienne planted. She seeded and cared for it and monitored for pollinator activity at the Science Center. So I wanted to bring this up, whether a practice constitutes beneficial use depends on whether the community as a whole considers it beneficial, but having a solution that protects both water rights and pollinators seems like one that's worth exploring. So I wanted to mention some of the great work that's happening in that area. Looking beyond sort of herbaceous plants, beyond forbs, beyond your wildflowers, there's lots of woody plants that are wonderful resources for pollinators, both for forage as well as for nesting. Woody plants add complexity and structure to landscapes that's very attractive to other kinds of wildlife. Birds look for distinct layers of vegetation when they're looking for perching sites and roosting sites and nesting sites. So having that complexity in the landscape with woody plants can add benefits for other wildlife alongside your pollinators. Those plants can also provide some protection against windy conditions, acting as a windbreak. Some of the woody trees, I mentioned that some native bees are strong flyers, but others, the smaller bees are maybe not as good flyers, and they can benefit from having some protection from the prevailing winds. So windbreaks can include plants that are attractive to pollinators themselves, which things like four-winged saltbush or elderberry. But if you're using them to screen out a neighbor's activities like pesticides, we would recommend planting species that aren't attractive to pollinators themselves. So things like conifers, the evergreen plants that aren't highly attractive to pollinators and also provide kind of a year-round protection and year-round screen. I'll talk more a little bit about pesticide drift mitigation at the end. So I know this presentation was advertised as sort of farms and ranches, and that much of our land in northern New Mexico is rangeland, but I will be the first to admit that range isn't my specialty, and I don't feel I can really do it justice. I do have a colleague that's a rangeland specialist who's working on a Grazing for Pollinators workshop that will be online, meant for New Mexico in the fall. So please do stay tuned for more detailed information about how to build pollinator habitat into rangelands. But I'll talk in general about some of the basic principles. So in general, we know that many different pollinators can thrive on rangelands. They have historically done so. They've adapted to disturbance cycles in native range. Range can have all of the pieces of the pollinator habitat puzzle. Wildflowers and shrubs that supply nectar and pollen, grasses and wildflowers that are host plants for butterflies and moths, nesting materials in the form of bunch grasses and pithy stemmed plants. And looking at the Western landscape as a whole, rangelands are these large connected habitat that offer this tremendous opportunity for pollinators. That said, we do know that flowering plants and their pollinators can suffer from the impacts of overgrazing. Highly palatable grasses and wildflowers are the first to disappear when you have a high stocking rate. So nesting would be that second habitat feature that would suffer from too many animals, with loss of stem nesting materials and compaction of ground nesting sites. So rangeland management, rangeland plant communities, and their pollinators, they're all very diverse and very site specific. It's impossible to prescribe a single management plan that's going to be ideal for all pollinators or all rangelands. So, but there are general sort of considerations that will benefit pollinators in many different situations. So just like with gardens and farms, I'm trying to give you like basic framework so that you can implement the same ideas in a way that suits your land, suits your knowledge, and suits your systems. The goal of these, in general, the best management practices for rangelands, is just to increase the number of plants that can reach flowering and to avoid other disturbances that could harm pollinators on rangelands. So some of these are going to sound pretty familiar. Use the proper stocking rate, allow time for plant recovery, avoid broadcast use of insecticides and herbicides. Insecticides can harm insects directly, or herbicides might indirectly harm pollinators through that loss of flowering resources. And with all grazing practices, monitor the effects on wildflowers and grasses and adjust as needed to improve those conditions for pollinators. That's all I'll say about that, but do stay tuned about for our Grazing for Pollinators that will go more in depth and be better able to answer your questions about it. I'll end the habitat section by just mentioning that the USDA has a variety of programs that offer technical and financial assistance for putting conservation practices like pollinator habitat in the ground. And I don't want to go into the details of every program from equipped to CRP, but if you're interested in this option, we have this publication available on our website that breaks down all the different various options in the Farm Bill for how we can use pollinator conservation, how we can support pollinator conservation on working lands. And you can also find your local NRCS or FSA service center at Farmers.gov and reach out to your local conservation planners for more info on those programs. So despite what this picture suggests, in this last section of the program, I'm going to stop talking about planting flowers, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about other farm management practices that can support or negatively impact pollinators. First is looking at nesting habitat. So taking steps to protect ground nesting sites around your property. Bees will nest all over farms, including along field edges, in fields themselves. Squash bees are notorious for nesting right under the plants that they're pollinating. So the thing to do here is really just to watch carefully, be observant, see where bees are active, and then protect existing habitat and nest sites from becoming disturbed. You might have bees right in the middle of your road, and there's not much you can do about that except try not to run them over directly. Part of this does include reducing the use of tillage where possible. I'll talk about that more on the next slide, as well as minimizing the use of plastic mulch and landscape fabric that covers a significant portion of your garden or your farm fields, particularly for crops like squash where the bees are nesting in the fields. If the field's covered in landscape fabric or plastic mulch, it makes it very difficult for those bees to access the soil surface and to build nests into those areas. So looking at tillage a little bit more depth, I know it's often one of the main strategies for combating weeds, especially in organic farms, but given that many bees are nesting underground, just want to give you a little bit more of a sense of how far down those bees might be nesting and how tillage might impact their nesting activity. So this is a figure from a review of about 445 bee species and how far down they nest. And on the left-hand side of the graph is nesting depth. So the top of the graph is the soil surface, and then the bottom of the graph is about a meter below ground. And then on the the bars are the percent of bee species nesting at each of those depths out of 445 bees. So you can see that the vast majority of bees are actually nesting in the top foot of soil. About, I think it's about 1 in 6 bees that they surveyed had a maximum nesting depth of only about 6 inches, and more than half were less than a foot below ground. So a deep till, so a foot below ground, that's where that red line would be. If you go a foot below ground, you actually are significantly impacting the nests of a lot of different bee species that are nesting in that top layer of soil. The shallower the tillage depth, the fewer bee species you're likely to impact. But reducing tillage events where possible will reduce disturbance to those below ground nesting bees and their offspring that are hanging out below ground. So that's tillage. Again, Amanda and I are going to talk in much more depth about pesticides next week, but a wide variety of pesticides can be harmful to pollinators and other beneficial insects. And when I say pesticides, I'm including all of the sides, right? So insecticides, fungicides, herbicides, etc. The risk to pollinators is influenced by a combination of the level of exposure and how toxic a specific pesticide is to pollinators, and sort of having an understanding of how these pesticides work and how they move in the environment, how they can be, how bees can be exposed, and then how they can be affected by the different levels of toxicity. All those things I think are important, even in scenarios where you have removed pesticides from your own management, right? So with a solid foundation of preventive farm practices, pesticides can be a shrinking part of management systems, but they are very common in both ag and urban settings. So you probably have them going on around you. So how can we protect beneficial insects and their habitat from pesticides? That's a question I'm going to answer in much more depth next week. But I did want to introduce you to sort of the different routes of exposure that a bee might have, just so that you can keep this in your head as you're thinking about how bees might be bringing pesticides back to their nests. So this is an example from the system I did my master's in, which is blueberries. So looking at a typical sort of ground-based tractor application, you might have honeybees that are in their hive off to the side of the field, and the honeybee is, this is a blueberry in bloom, so receiving direct exposure to a pesticide being applied during bloom. This is kind of like worst case scenario. Then you might have a native bee, like a bumblebee, also exposed by visiting the crop flower. Some pesticides are applied to the soil surface or are systemic, and so find them, actually even these foliar applications of pesticides, there was a study in blueberries that found that over 60% of the material actually finds its way into the soil at some time or another after application, usually right after application. So these are bees that are nesting below ground in the crop field and might be exposed through contaminated soil. They might also be finding themselves, finding residues, contaminated residues from drift on the side of the farm field. So contaminated nectar and pollen that is picked up by the adult female and brought back to her nest and fed to developing larvae. So you can have an oral route of exposure alongside this like direct contact route that a bee might experience on a flower. And the same here. This is a mason bee visiting a dandelion flower in the middle of the crop that was, not mowed before this pesticide application went on. That bee brought those residues back to her above ground tunnel nest. So lots of different ways a bee might be exposed while out visiting flowers. There are different strategies for reducing pesticide risk. Here are a couple of the publications that we use to look at, to sort of rank things by their toxicity to bees. We have this publication from Oregon State University is a very comprehensive guide to different pesticides and their toxicity to bees. And then we just came out with one last year looking at sort of the relative risks of different organic pesticides. Amanda and I are going to talk a lot more about preventive strategies and how to build sort of resilient pest management systems next week. But So I'll save that for next week since we're getting a little low on time here. The final piece is that you really can't change what your neighbor is doing, but you can change what you're doing. And so if you're planting flowering habitat, or if you have flowering habitat, you want that to be protected from pesticide drift. So one option where you can't build any kind of sort of spatial buffer between where a pesticide is being applied and where you have habitat would be to plant some tall, dense vegetation to intercept drift. And again, this would be the case where you would want to use non-attractive, dense species for drift protection. So things like conifers. You want them to be dense enough to be able to intercept that drift, and then porous enough to let the airflow through a little bit, you know, instead of just hitting the drift barrier and pushing up and over your vegetative barrier. So just hitting the exact right density. There's lots of sort of publications on how you craft the best windbreak for pesticide drift capture. So just to wrap up, that's the end of my farm management practice section. I did want to highlight an effort we've been working on for the last couple of years at Xerces, which is the Be Better Certified program, which is a certification and product labeling program that recognizes growers that have adopted farm management practices to support pollinators. So we've been working with a couple of growers to launch the program over the last couple of years, and have installed many acres of pollinator habitat and miles of hedgerows in California. We're just starting to see some of those products reach the shelves. So the basic standards for Be Better were developed out of that basic framework that I talked about today. So providing habitat, conserving nest sites, protecting habitat from pesticides, and then also having some standards and restrictions around management of commercial bumblebees, which was a topic I couldn't get into today. But if you're interested in learning more about this, and if you want to dive a little deeper into the production standards, which could be helpful if you're wanting to figure out some next steps for how you can improve conditions on your own property, those are all available at BeBetterCertified.org. You can also visit us at Xerces.org, where we have many, many kinds of resources, from fact sheets and brochures to guidelines and reports. We're working on some exciting new publications on soil invertebrates and soil health, guidance for plant nurseries. But if there's something that we haven't covered, please do let us know. We also have a few books. The books on either end here, the Attracting Native Pollinators and Farming with Native Beneficial Insects, are good resources for sort of farm management solutions and building habitat into landscapes. And so with that, I think I'll wrap up and take questions. I did want to remind you that we have this Ask Me Anything roundtable discussion that's happening on July 28th, the same time, 3 p.m. So if you don't have questions answered now, email your questions to nmsuipm@nmsu.edu, and we will work those into that program. So I hope you will join us for that.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, I wasn't sure. I can't see myself. So. Where am I here? There I am. All right. Thank you, Emily. That was really informative, and I definitely got a lot of really interesting questions. Miranda's been helping me take those as Dr. Skidmore. And let's see. And I see people are raising their hands. If you could actually go into the Q&A and type your questions in there, that would be the best way to go about this. And then someone asked if you could leave that last slide up with the books. Oh, I
went back. I just
Perfect.
saw that.
Okay. So let's see. One question here was, do you think you could time your tillage with the nesting period of bees? Or are there too many species of overlapping nesting periods? Like, when would be that best tillage time for?
Yeah, that's a really tricky question. There are so many species that nest below ground. So if you are growing squash, that question gets a little bit easier. You can till sort of at the beginning, when you're planting your squash fields. It's sort of during the crop flowering that squash bees are sort of burrowing in and making their nests. So afterwards would be when you wouldn't want to till. Otherwise, it's really tricky to try and time tillage because there's just so many different species that might be nesting below ground. Tillage during a flight period of a bee, if a female is out of the nest at the time that you till, she will probably come back and found a new nest. You will have disturbed her offspring. So yeah, it's a tricky question, and I think that's why I sort of leaned on reducing tillage events where possible, or going with shallower tillage where possible, just because of how many species there are in the ground at any one time.
Great, thank you. Let's see. So here's a good question, if you can think of something that can compete with thick grasses. Someone has an acequia irrigated 1 acre meadow, and there's a lot of grass seeds that float in and take over and create like a really thick mat of grasses, and they have some prairie clover, and white milkweed can compete with those grasses. But can you think of any native flowers that would be good at competing with those thick grasses?
Yeah, if your Mexican hat got crowded out, that's going to be a tricky one.
No.
Can you put your email in, and we'll follow up with you, and happy to chat it out.
Yeah, I can save her name. Okay.
Yeah, Caitlin and I are available for thinking through some of these questions on a site-by-site basis. It helps to have some pictures of what you have that are present already in the plant community.
Yeah. And there's a little bit of interest in tomato blossoms, how there's information about agitating them by your hands to increase yield, and that's kind of mimicking the buzz pollination.
Yes.
And then there are some that are self-pollinating, right? But you can have better yields if you have insect pollinators.
Right. Yeah, the same with blueberries. So there were some varieties that are even difficult for some bees to access because of how narrow the corolla has become over time. So some folks will go out with electric toothbrushes, which sort of stimulate that same buzz pollination and get the pollen to fall right out of the anthers.
Right. Okay. Do you have any idea how many acres or square feet are needed to sustain a colony of honeybees? Like, that's kind of hard to answer.
That's a really hard answer because it does depend on sort of how dense your flowers are in that area. I think, yeah, I don't have an immediate answer for you on that. Just to say that the more plants that you have, the better.
Yeah. It all depends on how many plants are there and how good of nectar and pollen resources they can offer too. So one question was, could you talk just a bit more about the intersection between soil health and benefits to pollinators?
Yeah, so, well, there are many different kinds of insects, not just pollinators that live below ground. So a lot of those invertebrates benefit from the same kind of soil health practices that are touted for their benefits to plants. So having soils that have better nutrient content, that are less compacted, that have healthy microbial and plant root communities can actually help pollinators when they're burrowing in and living in those environments. So the same kind of things would go for, having lots of contamination enter the soil environment. So pesticides coming into soil can impact not only the pollinators that are nesting below ground, but also, the microbial communities, the AMF, the fungal communities that help contribute to plant nutrition, So there's a lot of very cool interconnected relationships that happen below ground. They are influencing what we're seeing above ground. And then there's all these feedback loops between what's happening below ground and what's happening above ground. So diversity above ground can mean diversity below ground and vice versa. And we still have so much more to learn about how that works below ground. There's been so much less study on it. It's obviously much more difficult to see what's happening beneath the soil surface. But I get it talked in my ear all the time because my husband's a soil scientist. So in any case, we are going to come out with a pretty neat booklet on different soil invertebrates later this year. It's going to go into all the different kinds of the sort of big ecosystem engineers that contribute to functioning of soils.
Great. That was great. Yes, lots of connections above and below ground. You see that there. So it's 4 o'clock. Sorry if we didn't get to your question, but we will be able to address it in the Ask Me Anything, which is in 2 weeks. And then, yeah, if you have any more questions, please email nmsuipm, or yeah, nmsuipm at nmsu.edu.
And Catherine, your question about plants, Caitlin is working on a plant list for Albuquerque and Santa Fe. We are hoping to have that available. When did you say, Caitlin?
Hopefully by the end of August. But I can probably email Catherine and give her a quick idea so she's not waiting around until then.
Yeah, I would also encourage you to look up the Pollinator Plants of New Mexico document that both Caitlin and I had in our presentations the last couple of weeks. It's a little bit overwhelming, but you can find some good plant ideas in there. We're gonna take ours and make it quite a bit shorter so that it's less overwhelming. All right, thanks everyone for joining us. Really appreciate you coming to this series.